Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of In Lay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Askari, and today I'm very pleased to have on Mr. Albert Liu. How are you doing, Albert?
Payman, I'm great. How are you?
I'm really good, and I told you this before. I'm really excited to have you here. I think you're going to make for a really entertaining episode. So
Let's
I'm
hope
glad
so.
you.
I've also been looking forward to this.
All right, I'll try not to disappoint with my poor hosting skills. Um, Albert, so to get things started, I met you at the Giants Capitalism and Morality Conference, and you gave a private presentation at the dinner the night before, and I was really blown away. But to get things started, can you give people sort of a hint of your philosophy or how your contrarian view of media events?
Yeah, let me start by maybe talking about this event that we met at. This is capitalism and morality. It's mostly people of a conservative bent or libertarian or in sometimes anarcho-capitalist persuasion. And Giant asked me to do a presentation. I told him I'd been thinking about China lately because it's in the news a lot, and I proposed the idea of a presentation that would be a Western defense of communist China, and so that would be applying sort of my understanding of Western values and Western philosophy, particularly Austrian economics and anarcho-capitalism, and see if I could concoct a sort of a defense of China and the Chinese government, and he thought that would be fascinating. So he invited me to speak on that topic, and what happened was as I was building the talk, because in the end it didn't go the way that I planned actually. As I was building the talk, I was anticipating all of the objections that people might have. And so I just imagined myself putting up a slide and then being interrupted and someone saying, "But wait, and I realized that there's so much misinformation about China. After I'd built the slide deck and then tried to anticipate all of the objections, I just had a presentation that was just a bunch of spurs, tangents going off, addressing all of these things. But I didn't know how else to do it because I think I was justified in anticipating that people would have lots of objections and there'd be lots of misinformation. So the presentation ended up being, it wasn't the cohesive type of presentation I usually like to give. It was sort of a bunch of odds and ends about misinformation about China. And so even though that wasn't my intent to do a talk like that, I ended up talking about a lot of media misinformation. And then the theme was sort of, at least in one part of the talk, was what you think about these places is often not the truth. And perhaps the one item that I touched on that resonated with some people was just the events of Tiananmen Square, because and this was a June conference, so every year around June, the media comes out with its sort of rehashing of the events of 1989 Tiananmen Square, and they show Tank Man, and they have all this video footage and narrative about it. But the one thing that they never mention is that there was no massacre, and that's in Tiananmen Square. There's no massacre. We know that now because of WikiLeaks. They released um, cables from the Chilean embassy, and there was also later testimony by a BBC reporter and the bureau chief of the New York Times at the time, Nicholas Kristof, that just flatly said, like, look, there was no massacre in Tiananmen Square. And every year when they recount the anniversary of it, they neglect to tell us that. And so every year they're lying to us again. And so, that evening when you and I met, I ended up covering, several of these types of things where I feel like the media has betrayed us, has betrayed and has neglected their duty to keep us informed of the truth.
So, what is the truth about Tiananmen Square? What actually happened?
It's hard to say, right? But so if we're going to just stick with the facts, what we know is what I just said, and that is there was no massacre of students in the square. So that's misinformation. That's fake news. What we do know is that obviously there was a massive protest, and that the square was cleared, um, and it was cleared peacefully. Probably is not the right word, because there was some heavy-handedness, batons and whatnot, people getting roughed up and beaten up. But there was no spraying of bullets into the square. We have that from 3 Western sources. So that much is a lie. And what else happened? We can speculate on what happened. Um, there's there is a case to be made that this was actually a sort of a Western devised coup attempt. But you know, we don't have we have some circumstantial evidence of that, I guess. But I think what's important is that there was no massacre inside the square. That's pretty important, because a lot of people still believe that to this day.
So I don't actually, day to day, I don't think about Tiananmen Square that much. But from what little I know, I always thought it was um, like China was on the precipice. It could go for more freedom, or it could go towards authoritarianism. And they brought these tanks, and they killed thousands of people, and that's when it became full on tyrannical. Is any part of that true?
Well, the most important part is not true, right? I guess that was the point I'm trying to make, is that the tanks coming in and killing thousands of people. That's probably the most important part of what you just said. And that part didn't happen. The rest, yeah, sure, there were people, I imagine there were people protesting for more freedom of speech, but I've also read that, there are also like neo-Maoists, protesting against the reforms that were going on at that time, because they were in a period of transition, and any period of transition is going to be difficult for some people. And so there were people against that, and there were all kinds of people. If you just see, this is the I guess this is the genius of the color revolution. If you just kind of whip people up and say, everyone who has some disagreement with the government meet on Robson Street at 10, and you don't really say what it's about, you just whip up any discontent, you're going to get a really big group of people, right? And they're not necessarily there for the same reason. They're not necessarily protesting lack of freedoms or whatever. But every government has its flaws, and at any given time there are people who are upset, sometimes many, for different reasons. But if you just say, like, wear blue and show up on Robson Street, like, you get a lot of people for that. And that's what they do often, is they just stir up trouble, get people agitated and protesting, and that creates the energy and the chaos to do regime change.
And I know you don't feel comfortable, so we're gonna, when it comes to speculation. So this is just purely speculation. But what, if anything, was America's involvement in the potential coup?
Okay, so what we know is, during the events, and this is, you can read this in Western media if you look hard enough. But during the standoff with the students, U.S. intelligence and British intelligence were, maintaining contact with them from Hong Kong. So we know that. We know that. Let's see. We know that the leader. I went over this in my talk, but there's a documentary called what was it? The Gate of Heavenly Peace. You can see this on YouTube, actually, and they interview the leader of the revolt, and she admits that she's really maneuvering the students toward a massacre. It's what she wants, and she actually expresses frustration at the fact that there are other students, not in official capacity, working toward a peaceful solution. Um, so obviously that's not good. That she was maneuvering them toward a bloodbath. And then we also know that following the events, that a lot of those leaders ended up in the U.S. studying at Ivy League universities, and this also seems to be a pattern, that if you're a dissident and you cooperate, then you're rewarded with green card and admission to a prestigious university. So those are the things we know, and you there is there is precedence for this. And you and I talked a little bit about Iran, and there's definitely, documented precedent of, Western involvement in overthrowing governments. And it's admitted. The Clinton administration even apologized for this. Madeleine Albright actually issued a statement admitting the U.S. involvement in 1953. So we know it happens. It happens with unfortunate frequency, and so this Tiananmen Square fits the pattern of it. Whether or not we have smoking gun or whatever, I can't say, but it definitely fits the pattern.
Just for my own curiosity, like, do you ever bring this up in public? Just, you're going out for dinner and somebody and you bring it up and then they want to strangle you. Does that ever happen?
No, I until recently, I haven't even really been interested in politics, like not even domestic politics. But it's just recently with sort of the wave of first you see this sort of anti-Russian propaganda and racism, and then anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese sentiment and racism, that I decided to take a very close look at it. But no, this is not good dinner time conversation. This is, it's rare. It's rare and actually unprecedented for me to be online even talking about this, right? So I did this at a private event for a closed group of people, because I was asked to. But no, generally I don't. Generally, people aren't interested.
Fair enough. You mentioned sort of the whole Russia thing and anti-Chinese sentiment. I noticed this when the Ukraine war broke out, and the government of Canada was seizing assets, ships, yachts, private property. And no matter how much I told people, I'm like, guys, this is wrong. This is racism. Kicking him out of Olympic Games is racism. I couldn't get through to them. Did you feel that? Do you have any other examples of things like that?
I was at a conference. Part of the reason when we had to postpone our interview is because I was at a conference a couple weeks ago in Florida, and one of the attendees is a Russian speaking expat, and she said that on the flight there, someone asked to have to change seats because they heard her speaking Russian to one of her relatives, and they didn't want to be seated near someone who was speaking Russian. So yeah, I mean, there's an example right there. And this is several years removed from when I think the sentiment was the worst, which was right when the invasion took place, but it's still going on. It's horrible.
And what about with respect to Chinese people? How much of what's going on in Vancouver right now do you think is legitimate, and how much is it just xenophobia and racism? I'm talking about things like money laundering, the casinos, fentanyl. Like, how much of that is actually just hyperbole?
You know the so I don't live there, so I don't follow the politics. Um, Certainly, I think the fentanyl thing is overblown because that's an argument used in the U.S. as well. I think that's overblown. The other things I don't, and I wouldn't doubt that there's some criminal element involved. You have, I mean, it's been a long time since I lived there, but we've had back in the day we had youth gangs and whatnot, so criminal activity. But I can't speak to that. It wouldn't surprise me though if it was sort of similar in the sense that it's overblown and used, for political purposes or to influence people's opinions. You know, Here's the thing. So, I grew up there in the 70s and 80s, and at the time there was a lot of racism, but over time, it seemed to be getting better. And then I moved to the U.S. and I noticed it was quite a bit better, and I just attributed that to, yeah, on the one hand, changing times, but also to my own movements, like geographically. So, for instance, I moved from Canada to the United States. I was in Boston for a while. I moved to Texas. So I've lived around. And at each phase, as the situation got better, and I think the situation peaked sometime around like 2014, 2015, in my recollection, because I remember relations being very good I remember a lot of parents putting their kids in Mandarin language school. I just remember like a lot of positive energy around 2015, and then it went south, and that coincided with about the time I moved to California. So all this time, I thought that it was, being self-centered. I guess I thought it was me moving around was a factor, meaning like racism is worse in Canada than the U.S. It's worse on the East Coast than it is in Texas. And then when I went to California, it reversed again. So I thought, okay, it's worse on the coasts. But the one thing that I didn't account for was just the time effect, this temporal thing where U.S. foreign policy is changing the entire time, right? So for the longest time, the so-called enemies were, Muslims, right? We had, radical Islam or whatever, and that was where all the negativity was focused. And that was kind of so Asians kind of got off the hook for a little while. Whereas like coming off of Vietnam, it was very bad. Things cooled, and then there was this diversion, and so Asians were off the hook for a little while. But then when Obama and Hillary Clinton did that pivot to Asia, it all came right back, and the propaganda started again. So then I realized that there's like a political component, there's a messaging component. This is actually the media, because think about it, it's the same people, right? So the same people, the Americans that were so kind and so interested, these are the same people that now are down on China, right? So it's not them. I think it's the media.
Related to that, so this is a follow-up question. This concept of outsourcing manufacturing to China, which wiped out the middle class and the Rust Belt, how much of that is also sort of propaganda?
No, that's not propaganda at all. That's I think that's the pursuit of profits, right? And a failure of the West to invest in education and that type of thing, right? So yeah, Jamie Dimon, CEO of J.P. Morgan. I remember, like, I think it was coming out of the financial crisis. At some point, it was kind of out of the blue. I'm not sure why he made this statement, but he said that J.P. Morgan is not the most important thing in my life. Like, it's not my highest priority. My highest priorities are God, country, and then J.P. Morgan. And that sounds great, and I don't know if he meant that or not, so I don't want to question it. It sounds great, but that's not the way that U.S. corporations behave, right? They're not putting God and country first. They're putting profits first. And so if you put profits first, and your labor pool is falling behind, and you can do things cheaper somewhere else, then that's where you go. So that's what Apple did. That's what Tesla did. That's what a lot of these companies did. Car companies and whatnot moved to Mexico. This is about profits. And so I guess for us, we consider ourselves a capitalist society. How do we feel about that? How do we feel about corporations putting profits first, putting the shareholders first? That's sort of their mandate, right? That's what we demand of them. But then the result of that is, like you said, we lost our manufacturing sector, and that's tragic.
How do you deal with that in a free market economy where I guess I'm trying to square libertarianism with protectionism. Like where do you
Right.
draw the line?
Well, I don't know. That's for the society to decide, right? I mean, this is but clearly this is what happens, right? Um, I guess we could, yeah. Is it? You're kind of asking, like, is this sort of the necessary outcome of libertarianism? Maybe is what you're asking.
Like how do we like we all want liberty, but how do we get liberty without ending up with slavery? Or conversely, how do we prevent outsourcing of manufacturing without having to resort to big government?
Yeah, see, that's a really tough question for people in politics, right? So, and unfortunately, I'm not in politics. So the solution that we don't like would be for the government to sort of, you know, take control, right? We wouldn't want government to forbid this, as an example. And this is like, okay, so this is what's going on in Argentina right now. This debate they're having about export. duties, right? And the farmers, they have an agricultural sector that wants to sell abroad, but the government has imposed these export duties, and that kind of keeps their product captive, right? So it's a way to control food inflation in Argentina, but the entrepreneurs in agri don't like it, and it's a sort of the same sort of argument, right? Um, how much of this do you allow? And one of the things that because I've always been a free market advocate, but if you think about this, the free trade, when a very prosperous economy comes in contact with a very poor economy, and if you allow free trade, what's going to happen? Like if Argentina opens the doors completely and all of the food flows out of that country, what's going to happen? Right? Our arguments of free trade and free markets, they work well in sort of a level playing field where the I guess price levels and whatnot are in kind of a steady state. I mean, there's no such thing as steady state, but they're kind of like similar. But if you have a really rich country and a really poor one, you can see what the problems are going to be, right? And they're wrestling with that right now in Argentina. People are suffering, right? This guy I think he cut their pensions by 30%. I think so. The pensioners, you imagine like you plan your life according to this, right? You plan your life according to having a certain amount of Social Security or whatever they call it there, and then this guy comes along and cuts it by 30%. That's going to be tough. And then if he sort of deregulates the agribusiness, then these people who are very poor are going to be competing in the worldwide marketplace for food with people who can outbid them. So it's very problematic. So what can the government do? Well, the government, like I said, could step in. So in the case of manufacturing, they could, and they're trying to do this, I think, in some ways, right? They're trying to bring semiconductors back and whatnot, right? They're trying to do this with grants and whatnot. This is not something that libertarians are going to like, right? The other way to do this would be just to improve the education, I guess, so we actually have the workforce, which is what China did, and a lot of these countries have done. Is they've invested in the people. The problem with that politically is that that's that's a very long-term activity with a payoff that's way out in the future, so far out in the future that it's not going to help Payman get reelected, right? Like in a couple of years. So that is a problem with the system that I don't know how to resolve.
Very well. Let's go back to China. So we started with the Tiananmen Square, and then we went on down all these rabbit holes. What about the one-child policy? What are your views on that?
Well, personally, don't like it. Don't like the government telling me what to do. Don't really know where it came from. I mean, obviously the Chinese government, but I don't know, because there is sort of a Malthusian streak to the West as well. And you probably know the history of that. So there is a Malthusian streak to the West, and that was imposed at a time when China was sort of reintegrating back or opening doors to the West. So I don't know how that came to be, but personally, not a fan. I guess that's all I said. Personally, not a fan. Not a fan of population control. Not a fan of the government telling me how many kids I can have. Obviously. So yeah, I guess that's all I can say about that.
I guess I should have. The reason I asked that question is in the context of Western media misinformation, propaganda. Is this something that's actually happening, and it actually happened? It's factual, or are we misrepresenting it?
No, I think it happened. Yeah, I don't think that they deny that it happened. It's pretty well known and documented, and I don't think it's disputed.
All right. One last one for China, and I ask you this because you mentioned this during your presentation. I'm going to mispronounce this. Falun Gong. Falun Gong.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What's the
Falun Gong.
story there?
Yeah, that's a touchy one because so okay. Let me tell you. Last week I was in Montreal, and staying in old Montreal, which is near Chinatown. So when I'm in Chinatown, I like to go um, obviously eat, but then they have like a little memorial for Sun Yat-sen. Okay, so he's like, I like to kind of explain him as the Ben Franklin of modern China. He's kind of played a similar role in the revolution. So he's like a founding father, and he's revered all over China. So they have like a little, they have a statue of him. So I go there when I'm in Montreal, and every time I go, I have to walk around these protesters, right? That are like converged on the place, and you'll see that wherever you, like the Chinese consulate, where in various cities you'll see these people protesting. Um, and in the talk, I said like flat out, like I hate using the word cult to describe a group or religion, but many people would use that word to describe these guys. Um, this is they were expelled from China because they were sort of politically active, and they have some beliefs that people here would not approve of. They have racist views, they're homophobic views, and I think the New York Times did kind of an expose on them, exposing this. And the funny thing is they let it go on for a long time before they exposed them, and that was only after that Epoch Times, which is their media arm, really started to get behind Trump, that they came down on. So you can see where the priorities are. But this group, there's anti China. They spread a lot of misinformation, including like the Uyghur genocide and whatnot. And yeah, it's just not good. And I guess a lot of people don't realize they're doing this because, and this is the danger with media payment. You have to be really careful with people who say things that you agree with, because it's a really tricky way of getting you on board. So someone may, so I might come on here and intentionally say 5 things that your viewers really like, and it would be easy if I just learned a little bit about your audience. I could, anti-immigration, or not, maybe not anti, but stricter immigration. Or I could just read. Basically, I could just go to your website, read your program, find out what your people like, and just say that, right? And then once I've got them on board, I could just slip in something else that I want you to believe, to influence you. And then since I've already built this credibility, people say, well, he's good on this, he's good on that, and then I slip in this thing. Maybe you'd be tempted to go along with it. So I think a lot of people are getting swept along with this Falun Gong Epoch Times because they've been behind Trump, and so they say things that people like, but then they, once they got him, they hit with this anti-China propaganda, and I think it's very harmful. It's really harmful, and I think if we're not careful, this is going to lead down a very dangerous road. And this is something I said in the presentation too. Like, I just want to avoid wars. Really, I'm really, like, to the extent that I'm political, I'm anti-war political. So I don't want the war in Ukraine. Certainly don't want to go to war with Iran. I don't want to go to war with China or Russia either.
That's true. Nobody wants to go die in a foreign land. Albert, I want to transition to, this was the main reason I wanted to bring you on. I heard your presentation, putting China in an objective light, and I thought, how would Albert respond to doing sort of a similar exercise for my country of Iran? And that's why we started with Tiananmen Square. So in Iran, um, I'm getting this from my family and friends that, they go to a protest, and if they protest the government for too long, the government comes and starts like spraying them with bullets until they disperse, or they throw a couple hundred people in jail, execute a couple dozen. Is Iran just on like another level of tyranny in comparison to China, in your non-expert opinion?
Yeah, my non-expert opinion, especially with Iran, I'm like way outside my comfort zone. You have to understand that. But in general, I think, because this actually came up during my talk, is that if you look at freedom, and we enjoy in the West, and especially in the U.S., we enjoy, like, an exceptional amount of freedom of speech, right? Especially when it comes to political speech. Um, we enjoy an exceptional amount, and that's because like our government is secure. And so when you see people being denied that freedom, it usually correlates to the level of insecurity of the ruling class. It doesn't correlate, in my observation, to what kind of system, like what kind of economic system they're running, whether it's socialist or communist or capitalist. It more correlates to how scared people are, how scared, and in particular how insecure the ruling class is. And you see that when there's flashes of that even in this country, right? When there's flashpoints where, during 9/11, as an example, that was a huge incremental reduction in the amount of freedom we enjoy. Why is that? Well, obviously we were attacked in a very horrendous way, and so the regime locks down. And so I think that to the extent that Iran is less free than even China, if you want to use China as an example, it's because that the regime feels more threatened. And I actually think that they're very justified in feeling threatened. That you had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, right? So he's like a revered general, second most powerful person, just gets picked off. That's cause for concern. The president dies in a helicopter accident or a plane. I think it was a helicopter accident, right? Um, and this person was protege of the supreme leader, and so we don't know. I don't think we know how he died, or the circumstances behind that crash. But that's pretty suspicious too, right? So I think that, like what I said, is the crackdown correlates to how threatened the regime feels, and obviously the regime is on high alert. And I think that, based on what I just told you, they're justified in imagine if that happened here. Like, imagine, payment, was it last year, a Chinese weather balloon drifted across the continental USA, and people were like losing it. They were completely losing it over that, even though the Pentagon said, look, this thing is not anything you need to worry about. We don't think it's collecting information. Then they shot it down, and then the Pentagon confirmed, yeah, it wasn't collecting any information. But people completely lost it, and that was just a weather balloon. And then, meanwhile, Iran has this second in command being assassinated, and they're the protege of the supreme leader crashing tragically in a helicopter accident. I think you can understand why they would be on alert.
Here's another question. Uh, Contrast for me, like in Iran, there's a very real sense that it's the people versus the government, and the government is specifically for women, but it's interfering in their day to day lives. They have to cover their hair, and the people don't want it, and it's causing this conflict. Does a similar conflict exist in China?
Yeah, of course. A similar conflict occurs here, actually, right? To the extent that government restricts freedom, people push back. And so, yeah, that's I believe that's happening in Iran. I believe that's happening in China, but it's also happening here. It's just on different things, right? So, people here, they get upset if the government wants there's gun control, for example. That's a problem. We get upset here about issues with healthcare. Like, there's all kinds of spying, right? Data collection. um so yeah, I those are legitimate grievances, right, that people have. But those exist in all countries, I think.
All right, here's another question. You and I didn't talk about this, but I wanted to contrast the justice systems. So, if you were going to put it like in the rule of law, and to have like a really effective court system, how would you contrast the West, so Canada, America, with China, and then sort of just spitball it with Iran?
Okay. Wow. um I think, okay, so take China as an example to start. I think it's pretty widely acknowledged, even in the West, that Hong Kong, even after unification with China, has maintained um, sort of a very high level and a very effective and respectable level of justice. Um, so that's Hong Kong, but I think been successful in maintaining this like one country two systems concept. But the justice system is going to reflect the values of the people, right? So when you talk about Iran versus China, for example, and that was a question that you posed in an email to me, and I think it's a great question. At first, I didn't know how to tackle that because they're very different, and the justice system is going to reflect that. So Iran, you have a democratic but Islamic republic, right? So the justice system is going to reflect those values. And China, it's they're Marxist, right? So this is communist. Um, they call it a dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's a workers' state, right? Workers in charge, and there's no state religion, and so they're actually very different. And the legal systems will reflect that, and that's what you get. But I think at the end of the day, it's someone else's legal system, as far as I'm concerned, is up to them to decide, right? And there will be people who object, and that's fine. That's what we do here when we're unhappy about something. We object, but it's really none of our business. I think it's none of my business what happens in Iran and their legal system. I think it's totally up to them to decide.
All right, let's leave China in the rearview mirror and let's head over to. We'll talk about this briefly because you might not want to go into too much detail. Ukraine. So, talk to me about what perception do you have of media misrepresentation on what happened in 2014 until I think it was 2022, the invasion.
I think the misperception is they just don't talk about it, right? They just don't talk about anything that happened before the invasion or the special military operation, and I think that's the problem. I think, and I'm going to bring it back to Iran again. I think because I love that topic. But if you don't talk about what happened before, sort of the incident, the hostage taking at the embassy, that you really are going to get a really distorted view of the situation. Or if you only talk about nationalization of Iranian oil fields, and you don't talk about what happened before that, again, you're going to get a very distorted view of what happened. So regarding Ukraine, and there's like a lot of people you'll see, online who are much more knowledgeable than me that can talk about this. But basically, what you had was the U.S. interfering uh, in Ukrainian politics, overthrowing a democratically elected leader to put in sort of a Western-backed strongman who was discriminating against the ethnically Russian people of Ukraine and actually shelling those areas. And at some point, the Russians had enough and they interfered. That's their story, right? And that does not get reported very well enough. I think the reporting always concentrates on what happened after, and it's you know it's of course if you only hear one side, and this is the case often. If you only hear one side, of course you're going to get a distorted view of events.
And let's to round it off. Let's bring up some current events. Yesterday in Venezuela, Maduro he won with a 51% majority. The people in the country are citing election fraud. They're saying it was a stolen election, and Kamala Harris came out and immediately endorsed him. What do your spider senses tell you? What's right? What's wrong?
Well, let's remember that the U.S. government has been trying to change, has been trying to regime change them for a long time, right? They tried to regime change Chavez. They tried to install Juan Guaido. So, obviously, this is an adversarial situation, and I think in general, if any of these countries that have been deemed sort of an enemy, or and that's Venezuela, that's China, that's North Korea, that's Russia, that's Iran, that's Syria. Like are you going to really take at face value anything that comes out of the media regarding those countries? I think, you know, yeah. So without delving deeply into it, I don't know. I know that the those elections are monitored. They're scrutinized pretty heavily, right? And I think like with outside observers and stuff. So my gut instinct would not be to be suspect anything like crazily out of the ordinary. I mean, there might be some gaming here and there, which this the same degree that would happen anywhere. But I think because things would be to just say like, look, this is just the continued negative coverage of Venezuela.
Of Venezuela, because I was kind of young when Chavez came in, but then they had that hyperinflation thing. So like, what?
Yeah. So when you look at any of these countries, and especially and they come upon tough times, the narrative will always be, well, it's because of the socialism. Extent, because when you have, especially if you have, centralized, if you don't have a market sector, that's going to cause a lot of problems. It's going to cause malinvestment and shortages, like that. That's all true. But the thing is, they never mention like the exhaust. So Chavez comes in, and he has this plan of Bolivarian socialism, and he's going to have these centralized plans, which could be problematic, right? And sanctions are a big deal, right? You can't state the fact that the U.S. with Saudi Arabia can crash the oil price when they want. Russia and Venezuela, these oil dependent nations, it's going to hurt them a lot. So I think what you see, maybe a combination of sort of the economic policies, of the regime, and these sanctions that we apply are very tough, right? Because they're not direct sanctions or a primary sanction where we won't trade with them, but we also forbid other people from. Years ago, I think there was a diplomat from Venezuela who was working with Iran materials, and they grabbed this guy and arrested him for doing that. They grabbed him somewhere, took him to, and they did the same thing with the CFO of Huawei in Vancouver, where they accused, which is not a crime in most places, but that it violates U.S. sanctions, and so they just grabbed this lady. That kind of stuff, I don't think it lives up to our Western values. Of just grabbing people because they're engaging in free. It's very detrimental to the target nation, right? So, and that's what these countries live with. They live with being cut off from the rest of the world, and you see that's very tough. Even highly industrialized Western country, just like cutting them off from that with that pipeline, cutting them off from Russian. Yeah, just that act is devastating for the German economy, right? So you can see, like, even a highly industrialized, modern Western economy is vulnerable to sanctions or this type of interference where they're not allowed to trade. So I would say, anytime you see a news story like that, okay, look to see about the sanctions, and then take that into account. because that makes a big difference. And North Korea is another example, right? North Korea was actually doing okay, but when the Soviet Union fell and they lost their access to petroleum, I mean, that was a disaster for them, right? And they were sanctioned. They couldn't because of the petrodollar. They couldn't buy from anyone else, and that was a key component in a lot of their suffering in the 90s. Was just Soviet Union falling, having no place to obtain petroleum, not being able to fuel their agribusiness, being cut off from the rest of the world through sanctions. That's what caused a lot of the pain. It wasn't just their sort of their communist philosophy. It was sanctions and Soviet Union falling.
I did not know that about North Korea. I learned something else today. What should we end it on? What about the sanctions against Russia? When I saw that, I thought this is going to be a massive blunder. That's going to it's going to blow back. How much of an effect do you think that had in pushing Russia closer to China in this BRICS agreement?
Uh, I think it made it so they had no choice. I mean, they may have done it anyway, but this pretty much, I think, in the minds of a lot of people when they saw that, and they're seizing their funds, freezing and seizing. I think is what Ursula von der Leyen said. We're going to seize, not just freeze. Um, Seizing their reserves, their foreign reserves. That just sent a message to everyone that you could be next. So yeah, that did not work out the way they thought, and I was actually surprised. I thought Russia would be hurt more because we just finished talking about how devastating sanctions could be. Um, I thought they would have suffered more, but they just found a way around it because more and more people, more and more countries are sort of inching away and feeling more comfortable deviating from the dictates of the West, right? So, for example, um, Russia couldn't sell their energy to Europe, but India was happy sort of to buy the difference and resell it. China's happy to purchase Russian energy. So you can see sort of some of the strength of the sanctions is just starting to be diffused just by the fact that people are willing to move away and act according to their own interests rather than just towing the U.S. line.
Albert, we're at the end of the show. Do you want to maybe tell the audience where they can follow you? You mentioned something about a conference you're going to.
Yeah. So first, I run a website with my partner Rick Rule for people who are interested in investing in natural resources, and particular precious metals like gold, silver, and that's called ruleclassroom.com, Rule classroom.com. And so I invite everyone to come there. We're not talking about politics in general over there. We're just talking about how to invest in precious metals and mining companies. So please check that out. And also, I'm going to be at the Money Show this week, August 1st through 3rd. So if you get this message in time and you want to attend a talk, there's all kinds of topics on alternative investments there, but I'm going to be talking about investing in gold and gold companies. So that's the Money Show in Las Vegas. I'll provide payment with a link just in case you're interested in checking it out. Thanks for that.
Viva, Viva Las Vegas. Albert, well, thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed this, our talk, and I'm sure the audience learned a wealth of information. So thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thanks so much, Payman. Always a pleasure.